Hi, I'm Austin. I'm a product development lead at Griffin Armament, and the video today covers the Griffin 2-stage adjustable AR-15 triggers. First, I wanted to cover specifications. So the trigger is a 4.5 pound with the standard spring, and 5.5 pound with the increased power trigger return spring. 2-stage Krieger Milazzo style trigger with adjustment for over travel and disconnector engagement. The trigger's materials are 440C stainless tool steel and 8620 case hardened and black oxided for the trigger itself. The trigger comes with takedown pins that are dimpled. That allows you to use a 1/16 or 3/32 flat punch to knock them out without danger of scratching your firearm's finish. And the trigger kit comes with the 16th Allen key for adjusting the trigger. Before we get into initial quick adjustments of the trigger, we'd like to cover safety. So before you touch your firearm for installing the trigger, let's take the lower receiver off the upper receiver, putting it into a non-firing configuration for the duration of the work and testing of the trigger for both safety and function. The trigger, as it arrives to you, will be pre-adjusted from the factory. We use a blue temporary Vibratite. So when the guys install that, they put the blue Vibratite on all the threads of the screws, run the screws in, and then they put it up in a fixture and set it up. And that Vibratite essentially will be set up when you get it, and that'll provide some resistance. You'll hear like a clicking as you adjust the screws, but the Vibratite is still going to hold those screws for several adjustments. So you shouldn't have to add any thread locker, but if you do, make sure it's a temporary blue so that you can still move the screws around. To install the trigger, you're going to have to run your pistol grip screw, the 1/4-28 screw out, and probably remove the safety selector in your gun. And when you take the pistol grip off, be mindful of the fact there's a detent on the, I believe, right side of the receiver, the ejection port side of the receiver. So make sure you don't lose the spring or detent when taking that apart. But then you go ahead and knock the fire control pins out of your lower receiver. Install these components, starting with the trigger. When you install the hammer, the spring legs on the hammer spring will go over the top and to the outside of the trigger spring, and one of the legs will engage. One of the legs of the spring will engage the grooves in the pin, retaining the trigger pin. After you've put the hammer in properly and pinned it, it has a J-spring internal to itself that engages that central groove on the fire control pin. Once you assemble the trigger, cock the hammer, and what you'll see is that the way that a 2-stage trigger functions is that as we squeeze the trigger, the trigger moves, and ultimately the hook on the rear of the hammer will touch the disconnector. That is the perception of feel of the second stage. So essentially, in take up, the rear hook on the hammer reaches the disconnector, and that wall of extra pressure you feel interacting with the disconnector under its spring tension is the second stage. And a quick check would be rotate your safety selector to safe, try to fire your rifle. The hammer should not fall. If the hammer doesn't fall, we're good in that category. Put it to semi-automatic, holding the lower that we've talked about off of the firearm in a non-firing configuration, lower receiver only. Squeeze the trigger and take up slack several times back and forth and release the trigger and touch that wall, and you shouldn't have your hammer fall. And if your hammer falls during quick take up of the trigger slack several times, you may want to increase the disconnector engagement on your gun, which is to say add a little bit of creep so that you have the ability to control your own trigger. And the means of adding engagement is to take the 16th key in the rear screw on the trigger, and we loosen the screw very slightly, like 1/8 of a turn at a time, and retake our test with the slack. And if the hammer doesn't fall, we've now achieved an adjustment that should work for us. Now go ahead and fire the trigger, and if you feel there's too much over travel, you can reduce over travel by advancing the forward screw. And the best way to set over travel would be advance it, say like 1 turn, lock the hammer, pull the trigger, and while pulling the trigger, loosen this forward screw until the hammer falls. At the moment of hammer fall, we'll want to add like 1/8 of a turn of loosening of this screw so that we can account for like temperature swings and the thermal stability of the aluminum and metal parts in the receiver. Now that we've covered quick adjustments that you might want to make to the trigger in the event you didn't like the way it was adjusted from the factory or had some kind of functional issue, I'd like to cover fixing the trigger if you've adjusted it in error a gross amount and want to return to more like a factory configuration. And the way we do that is seat this forward screw to level with its screw pocket surface. And once we seat level, we advance it 3 turns. And with the disconnector screw, we'd seat it flush and loosen it about 1/2 a turn. Then we reassemble it in the firearm, the lower receiver only, again for safety reasons. And the first thing we do is cock the hammer, and what would probably happen is that the disconnector won't release from the hammer. And so we insert the screw and advance the screw in a clockwise direction, reducing the disconnector engagement until we hear a pop of the hammer snapping upward into engagement with its primary sear after leaving the disconnector hook engagement. And then we want to advance the screw just another probably 1/16 to 1/8 of a turn for climate conditions. And then the very next thing we want to do, lower receiver only, pull the trigger. It shouldn't fire because this trigger screw is so far down that we don't have enough travel. And we'll begin loosening the screw until the hammer falls. At the moment the hammer falls, we'll want to give that a 1/16 to 1/8 of a turn as well of additional loosening so that we can make up for those climate changes. At that point, you're initially adjusted, and you could fine tune the disconnector from there, but you'll want to, every time you try to fine tune, you'll want to come onto the trigger several times fast to make sure you don't have any instances of inadvertent hammer fall, because we want to have total control of our trigger system. And so the point at which this is adjusted for any individual shooter is where you've achieved minimal over travel and minimal creep, coupled with the ability to, for you, the end user, control the trigger in a predictable manner. And at that point, we want to rotate our safety to safe, pull the trigger, hammer doesn't fall, rotate the selector to fire, squeeze the trigger, hammer should fall. And at that point, we've achieved adjustment of the Griffin 2-stage Krieger Milazzo style match trigger.